In a medieval kingdom where the air was thick with tension, life had become unbearable for most of its people. The rich lived in opulence behind towering castle walls, feasting on delicacies while the poor struggled to find even a scrap of bread. The streets were filled with whispers of discontent as farmers, merchants, and laborers grew weary of heavy taxes and harsh punishments imposed by the ruling class. Hope seemed like a distant dream, and anger simmered just beneath the surface. At the center of this unrest stood Eric, a man whose reputation preceded him. Standing taller than most men, with arms like tree trunks and fists that could crush stone, Eric was both feared and respected. Once a soldier in the royal guard, he had been known for his unmatched strength and loyalty. But those days were long gone. After an incident involving a nobleman abusing a young boy, Eric had intervened, and paid dearly for it. Dishonorably discharged and branded a troublemaker, he became an outcast, wandering from village to village, taking odd jobs to survive. Despite his rough exterior, Eric carried a deep sense of justice, though it often clashed with his explosive temper. On the other side of the divide was Captain Valen, a man held in high regard by all who served under him. Clad in shining armor and carrying himself with quiet dignity, Valen was everything a leader should be: fair, disciplined, and unwavering in his commitment to duty. Yet, even he couldn't ignore the growing divide between the rulers and the ruled. Every day, he saw the desperation in the eyes of the common folk, the same desperation that fueled rebellion among former soldiers and peasants alike. Though loyal to the crown, Valen often wondered if the system he vowed to protect was truly worth saving. The kingdom itself felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. Rumors swirled about secret meetings in dark alleys and hidden caves where disgruntled citizens plotted against the monarchy. Among them were ex-soldiers like Eric, men who once fought for the realm, but now found themselves abandoned by it. They spoke of overthrowing the corrupt elite and creating a world where everyone had a voice. These whispers reached the ears of the king, who responded not with reform but with fear, ordering stricter laws and harsher penalties for dissent. Meanwhile, ordinary life continued in the shadow of these brewing storms. Markets bustled during the day, but at night, the streets emptied quickly, leaving only the howling wind and flickering torchlight. Children played games imagining battles between brave heroes and evil tyrants, unaware of how close their fantasies were to reality. It was within this fragile balance of power and resentment that fate prepared to bring two very different men face to face. Little did anyone know, a single act of defiance would soon ignite a chain reaction, forcing individuals like Eric and Valen to confront not only each other, but also their own beliefs. As the sun set over the kingdom, casting long shadows across its cobblestone streets, the stage was set for a story that would change lives forever. For in times of chaos, legends are born, and legacies are decided in mere seconds. Life in the kingdom was hard, but for Eric, it had become a daily grind of survival. He found work at a dimly lit tavern on the outskirts of the city, where weary travelers and locals gathered to escape their troubles, if only for a few hours. The air inside was thick with the smell of ale and roasted meat, and the noise of clinking tankards and lively chatter filled the room. It wasn't much, but it gave Eric a place to earn his keep and to listen. The tavern was a hub of gossip, where news of rebellion, royal decrees, and rising discontent spread like wildfire. One evening, as Eric wiped down tables after a long day, the door swung open, and a group of guardsmen entered. They were loud, boisterous, and clearly drunk on power as much as on the ale they demanded. Their armor gleamed under the flickering lanterns, a stark contrast to the worn clothes of the other patrons. They swaggered to a corner table, shoving aside anyone who got in their way. One of them, a burly man with a sneer that never left his face, grabbed a mug from a serving girl so roughly that she stumbled backward, nearly dropping the tray she carried. The tension in the room grew palpable. Patrons exchanged nervous glances but said nothing, knowing better than to cross armed men. The guards laughed among themselves, mocking the villagers' poverty and making crude jokes about how these peasants deserved nothing more than scraps. Eric clenched his fists as he overheard their insults, his jaw tightening with every word. But he stayed silent. For now. The situation escalated when one of the guards spotted an old man sitting quietly in a corner, nursing a single cup of water. The guard strode over, yanked the cup from the man's hands, and shoved him to the ground. "You think you deserve this place," the guard barked, kicking dirt into the old man's face. "Get out of here before I make you regret staying." Eric's blood boiled. He couldn't stand by any longer. Pushing away from the bar, he stepped forward, his towering frame casting a shadow over the guard. "Leave him alone," Eric growled, his voice low but commanding. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the brewing confrontation. The guard turned to face Eric, sneering. "Or what? You gonna stop me, brute?" Without hesitation, Eric moved closer, his presence alone enough to make the guard take a step back. "I said leave him alone." His tone left no room for argument. The other guards quickly rose to their feet, drawing their swords. "You're outnumbered, fool," one of them spat. "This isn't your fight." But Eric didn't back down. He stood firm, his fists clenched, ready to defend the innocent man, and perhaps vent some of his pent-up rage against those who represented everything wrong with the kingdom. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, the door burst open again, and Captain Valen walked in, flanked by 2 soldiers. His sharp gaze swept across the scene, taking in the frightened patrons, the defiant Eric, and his own men spoiling for a fight. "What's going on here?" Valen demanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. His arrival momentarily froze everyone in place. For a brief moment, it seemed like reason might prevail, but Eric's anger was too raw, and the guard's arrogance too great. The standoff was far from over, and the choices made in the next few moments would set events into motion that neither side could have anticipated. Captain Valen's voice cut through the tension like a knife, demanding answers. His sharp eyes moved from the trembling old man on the ground to Eric's towering frame, and then to his own guardsmen, who were still gripping their swords tightly. The room was silent except for the faint crackling of the fire in the hearth and the nervous shuffle of feet as patrons tried to make themselves invisible. Everyone knew that whatever happened next would define the night, and perhaps their lives. "Eric," Valen said firmly, stepping closer to the brute. "Stand down. This isn't worth your freedom or your life." His tone was calm but carried an edge of authority that commanded attention. Valen had always been respected, even by those who disliked him, because he was fair. But tonight, fairness wasn't what fueled the situation. It was anger, pride, and years of simmering resentment. Eric didn't move. His chest rose and fell with deep breaths, his fists still clenched at his sides. "These men think they can treat people like animals," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "They'd push us around, mock us, hurt us, and you expect me to just stand aside?" Valen sighed, his expression softening slightly. He understood Eric's pain. He'd seen it in the faces of countless villagers during his patrols. Yet duty bound him to uphold the law, even when the law felt unjust. "I'm not excusing their behavior," Valen replied evenly. "But violence will only make things worse, for everyone. Let me handle this." The guard who had shoved the old man snorted derisively. "Handle it. Captain, this beast attacked one of us. He needs to be taught a lesson." His words ignited murmurs among the other guards, their loyalty to each other outweighing any sense of restraint. Eric turned his gaze toward the guard, his eyes blazing with fury. "Taught a lesson. You're the ones who need teaching." Before anyone could react, Eric lunged forward, grabbing the guard by the front of his armor and lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. The guard flailed, panic flashing across his face as Eric brought him within inches of his own. "Enough," Valen shouted, drawing his sword in one swift motion. The metallic ring echoed through the tavern, freezing everyone in place. Even Eric hesitated, though his grip on the guard remained firm. Valen stepped between them, his blade pointed downward but ready to act if needed. "Put him down, Eric. Now." For a moment, it seemed like Eric might ignore the order. His knuckles widened as he tightened his hold on the struggling guard. But something in Valen's steady gaze, a mix of warning and quiet understanding, gave him pause. With a growl, Eric released the guard, letting him drop to the floor in a heap. The man scrambled back to his feet, embarrassment burning in his cheeks as he rejoined his comrades. "You've made your point," Valen said, lowering his sword slightly. "But this ends here. Leave now, Eric, before this goes further." Eric stared at Valen, his chest still heaving. He wanted to argue, to demand justice for the old man and all the others who had suffered under the guard's cruelty. But he also knew that staying would mean certain arrest, or worse. Forcing himself to take a step back, he turned toward the door, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor. As Eric reached the threshold, one of the guards muttered under his breath, "Coward." It was barely audible, but Eric heard it. Without hesitation, he spun around, crossing the distance between them in 2 strides. Before anyone could stop him, he delivered a single devastating punch that sent Valen crashing to the ground. The room erupted into chaos. Patrons screamed and scattered, knocking over chairs and tables in their haste to escape. Valen lay stunned, his helmet askew, as his men rushed to his side. Eric stood over him for a brief moment, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Then, realizing what he had done, he turned and fled into the night, disappearing into the shadows. As the dust settled, Valen slowly pushed himself to his feet, brushing dirt from his armor. Pain shot through his jaw, but it was nothing compared to the weight of what had just happened. Word of this incident would spread quickly, and Eric's fate was sealed. He was now a marked man. Yet, as Valen looked around the ruined tavern, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than met the eye. And deep down, he wondered if the real enemy was the system they both served. The news of Eric's attack on Captain Valen spread like wildfire through the kingdom. By morning, posters with Eric's likeness were plastered on every street corner, offering a hefty reward for his capture. The guardsmen who had witnessed the incident described him as a dangerous brute, someone who threatened not only their lives, but the very order of the realm. To the common folk, however, whispers told a different story. Many saw Eric as a symbol of resistance, a man brave enough to stand up against the arrogance and cruelty of those in power. Valen wasted no time organizing a search party. As dawn broke, he led a group of soldiers into the dense forest surrounding the city, knowing full well that Eric would likely seek refuge there. The towering trees blocked out much of the sunlight, casting long shadows over the uneven ground. Birds chirped nervously overhead, disturbed by the sound of armored boots crunching through leaves and twigs. Despite the urgency of the mission, Valen couldn't shake the unease growing within him. As they moved deeper into the woods, Valen found himself reflecting on the events at the tavern. He replayed the scene in his mind. The tension, the anger, the moment Eric's fist connected with his jaw. It wasn't just the physical blow that lingered. It was the look in Eric's eyes. There had been rage, yes, but also pain. Pain that mirrored what Valen had seen countless times during his patrols. Hunger, exhaustion, fear, all etched into the faces of the people he swore to protect. For the first time, Valen began to question whether he was truly serving justice or merely enforcing a system designed to keep the powerful safe while crushing everyone else beneath its weight. Meanwhile, Eric navigated the forest with practiced ease. He knew these woods well, having spent many nights camping here after being cast out of the royal guard. His thoughts raced as he moved silently between the trees. He cursed himself for letting his temper get the better of him back at the tavern. Striking Valen hadn't solved anything. It had only made things worse. Now he was a fugitive, hunted not just by the guards, but by the entire kingdom. But running wasn't an option anymore. Eric realized that sooner or later he'd have to face what he'd done and decide where his path would lead next. As night fell, he came across a small village hidden deep in the forest. The villagers recognized him immediately, some stepping forward cautiously while others hung back, unsure whether to trust him. Word of his defiance at the tavern had reached even this remote place, and many saw him as a hero. One elderly woman approached him, her hands trembling as she held out a loaf of bread. "We've heard what you did," she said softly. "You stood up for us when no one else would. Please, stay with us tonight. Rest." Eric hesitated. Accepting their help meant putting them in danger, but he couldn't deny the warmth in their eyes, or the gratitude in their voices. Reluctantly, he nodded and followed them to a modest hut where they offered him food and shelter. That night, as he sat by the fire listening to their stories of hardship and suffering under the king's rule, something shifted inside him. These people weren't just victims. They were fighters, clinging to hope despite everything stacked against them. And they were looking to him for leadership. Back in the forest, Valen's search continued. Though he pushed his men hard, he couldn't ignore the growing doubts gnawing at him. Was arresting Eric really the right course of action? Or was he simply perpetuating the cycle of oppression that had driven so many to desperation? Each step forward felt heavier than the last, burdened not by armor, but by the weight of his conscience. By the third day, Valen's instincts led him closer to the hidden village. Unbeknownst to either man, their paths were about to cross again. And this time, the stakes would be higher than ever. Both Eric and Valen were being pulled toward a confrontation that neither could avoid, one that would force them to confront not only each other, but also the truths they'd been trying to ignore. In the heart of the forest, amidst the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant calls of wildlife, destiny awaited. As the days passed, Eric and Valen found themselves gathering allies in very different ways, but with one thing in common. Both men were driven by a growing sense of purpose. For Eric, the villagers who had taken him in became more than just supporters. They became his family. Their stories of hardship lit a fire within him, fueling his determination to fight back against the injustice that had plagued their lives for so long. The old woman who had offered him bread now shared tales of her son, conscripted into the royal army and never seen again. A young farmer spoke bitterly of losing his crops to unfair taxes, leaving his children hungry. Each story added another layer to Eric's resolve. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for them. Word of Eric's presence spread quickly through the forest villages. Dozens began flocking to his side, drawn not only by his strength, but also by his willingness to stand up to those in power. Among them were former soldiers like himself, men who had once served the crown but now felt betrayed by it. Together, they formed a ragtag group of rebels, united by a shared desire for change. Eric, though reluctant at first, soon embraced his role as their leader. His temper still flared occasionally, but he learned to channel it into strategy rather than destruction. Under his guidance, the rebels began planning bold moves to strike at the heart of the kingdom's wealth, the royal treasury. On the other side of the conflict, Valen faced challenges of his own. While leading patrols and interrogating villagers suspected of aiding Eric, he couldn't ignore the growing discontent among his own men. Many of them whispered about the fairness of their mission, questioning whether hunting down a man who defended the weak was truly justice. Even Valen's second-in-command, a seasoned soldier named Garrick, voiced his concerns. "Captain," Garrick said one evening as they sat by a campfire deep in the woods, "do we really believe this is right? These people are starving. Is it any wonder they're turning against us?" Valen stared into the flames, his mind heavy with doubt. "It's not our place to question the king's orders," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "We swore an oath. But what if the oath is wrong?" Garrick pressed gently. "What if we're protecting something that doesn't deserve protection?" The question lingered in the air, unanswered. That night, Valen lay awake under the stars, wrestling with his conscience. He thought about the faces of the villagers he encountered during his search, faces filled with fear, anger, and desperation. He remembered the old man at the tavern, the serving girl whose tray had been snatched away, the countless others living in poverty while the nobles feasted behind castle walls. Slowly, painfully, Valen realized that loyalty to the crown didn't mean blind obedience. It meant doing what was right, even when it was hard. The turning point came during a raid on a rebel camp hidden in the hills. Valen and his men surprised a small group of insurgents late at night, catching them off guard. Swords clashed in the darkness, and several rebels fell before the rest surrendered. As dawn broke, Valen surveyed the scene. Wounded fighters lying on the ground, their weapons scattered around them. One of them, an elderly blacksmith who had joined the cause after losing his shop to unpaid debts, looked up at Valen defiantly. "Go ahead," the man spat. "Kill us. But know this, you'll never silence the truth." Valen hesitated. Killing unarmed prisoners went against everything he believed in, yet executing rebels was standard practice. After a long pause, he lowered his sword. "Tend to their wounds," he ordered his men, "and bring them back to the city alive." The decision shocked his troops, and likely sealed his reputation as either a traitor or a hero, depending on who told the tale. News of Valen's mercy reached Eric through spies among the villagers. At first, Eric dismissed it as a trick, a ploy to gain trust. But as reports continued to pour in, he began to see Valen in a new light. Perhaps the captain wasn't just another cog in the machine. Perhaps he, too, was searching for a way to fix what was broken. Both men were changing, shaped by the choices they made and the people they met along the way. Eric grew more strategic, learning to balance his rage with reason. Valen became more compassionate, questioning the system he had sworn to serve. And though neither realized it yet, their paths were converging toward a moment that would test not only their strength, but also their beliefs. In the shadow of rebellion and duty, alliances were forming, and destinies were being rewritten. Eric's plan to raid the royal treasury was as bold as it was dangerous. Hidden deep within the heart of the castle, the treasury was a fortress in itself, guarded by thick iron doors, armed sentries, and intricate locks designed to thwart even the most skilled thieves. But Eric wasn't just any thief. He had spent days studying the guards' routines, mapping out escape routes, and rallying his rebels for what he called their moment of reckoning. The treasure stored inside wasn't just gold or jewels. It represented years of suffering extracted from the poor and hoarded by the elite. To Eric, taking it back wasn't theft, it was justice. The night of the raid arrived under a sky cloaked in heavy clouds, hiding the moon and stars. Eric led his team through the forest, their movements silent and deliberate. Each rebel carried a weapon scavenged from old battles, and though they were outnumbered and outmatched, their resolve burned brighter than ever. As they approached the outer walls of the castle, Eric gave one final speech. "Tonight, we take a stand," he whispered, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Not for revenge, but for hope. For every person who's gone hungry while the king feasts. We can't fail." Unbeknownst to them, Valen had anticipated this move. His instincts told him that Eric wouldn't settle for small victories. He would aim for something big enough to cripple the monarchy's power. For days, Valen had stationed extra patrols near the treasury, reinforcing its defenses without alerting the public. When the rebels slipped past the outer gates using a forgotten sewer tunnel, Valen's men were waiting inside. The ambush struck like a storm. As Eric and his team emerged into the treasury chamber, torchlight glinted off rows of armored guards blocking their path. Swords clashed almost immediately, the sharp ring of steel echoing through the cavernous room. Eric fought like a man possessed, his brute strength overpowering several guards at once. But no matter how many fell, more seemed to rise in their place. The rebels fought valiantly, but the odds were against them. One by one, they were overwhelmed and captured, until only Eric remained standing. Valen stepped forward then, his sword drawn but lowered. "It's over, Eric," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Surrender. I don't want to kill you." Eric turned to face him, bloody but unbroken. His chest heaved with exertion, and his eyes blazed with defiance. "You think I'll bow to you again?" he snarled. "After everything your kind has done?" "I'm not asking you to bow," Valen replied, taking a cautious step closer. "I'm offering you a chance to live, to make things right." For a moment, Eric hesitated. Part of him wanted to charge forward, to fight until his last breath. But another part, the part shaped by the villagers who believed in him, knew there was still work left undone. Before he could decide, Valen added quietly, "The king plans to execute anyone tied to this rebellion, not just fighters, but families too. If you die here tonight, hundreds will pay the price." That stopped Eric cold. He glanced around at his fallen comrades, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. Then he looked at Valen, searching for deceit, but finding none. Slowly, reluctantly, he dropped his weapon. The clatter of metal hitting stone echoed through the chamber, signaling his surrender. As the guards moved in to bind him, Valen stepped aside, his expression unreadable. Though victorious, he felt no triumph. Instead, a deep sadness settled over him. He knew that capturing Eric wouldn't end the rebellion. It would only fuel it further. And yet, he also knew that sparing the man's life might give them both a chance to rewrite the rules of the game. Bound and escorted toward the dungeons, Eric kept his head high, refusing to show weakness. But inside, doubt swirled. Had he failed his people? Or was this merely the beginning of something greater? Meanwhile, Velen watched from the shadows, wrestling with his own questions. By choosing mercy over vengeance, he had crossed a line, one that could cost him dearly. But perhaps, just perhaps, they had both taken the first step toward something neither expected: redemption. In the quiet aftermath of the battle, the kingdom held its breath. Two men, once enemies, now stood at a crossroads. Their choices would ripple far beyond themselves, shaping the future of everyone caught in the struggle between oppression and freedom. The throne room was a place of grandeur and intimidation, its towering ceilings adorned with golden chandeliers that cast flickering light across marble floors. The king sat upon his gilded chair, his expression unreadably stern as Eric was dragged before him in chains. Bloodied and bruised from the battle at the treasury, Eric still carried himself with an air of defiance, refusing to bow despite the jeers of the courtiers gathered around. Captain Valen stood nearby, his armor gleaming, but his face pale with tension. He had brought Eric here not just as a prisoner, but as a gambit, a risky attempt to change the course of fate. "Your Majesty," Valen began, stepping forward when the king raised a hand for silence. "This man is guilty of treason, yes, but executing him will only deepen the unrest spreading through your kingdom." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and several nobles shot Valen disapproving glances. It was unheard of for a guardsman to question the king's judgment so openly. Valen pressed on, undeterred. Eric has become a symbol to the people, a figurehead for their grievances. Killing him won't silence them. It will ignite a fire you cannot control. Instead, let us use his influence to negotiate peace. The king leaned forward, his piercing gaze locking onto Valen. "Negotiate? With traitors? Have you lost your wits, Captain?" His voice boomed through the chamber, causing even the bravest courtiers to flinch. Yet beneath the anger, there was a flicker of unease, a recognition that Valen's words held truth. Rumors of rebellion had reached the castle walls, and whispers of dissent were growing louder by the day. Before the king could dismiss the idea entirely, Eric spoke up, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "You think I care about saving my own skin?" he growled, glaring at the monarch. "I'm here because these people, your people, are starving while you drown in gold. If you kill me, others will rise. You can't stop them all." The room fell silent, the weight of Eric's words hanging heavy in the air. For the first time, the king hesitated. He glanced toward his advisors, who exchanged uneasy looks, unsure how to respond. Valen seized the moment, leaning closer to the throne. "Your Majesty, consider this. What if Eric helps broker a truce? What if we address the grievances of the villagers, not out of fear, but because it's the right thing to do? This isn't weakness, it's leadership." For long moments, the king said nothing, his fingers drumming against the armrest of his throne. Finally, he rose to his feet, his decision clear. "Very well," he declared, his tone clipped but firm. "Eric, you'll live, for now. But mark my words, one misstep, and you'll hang alongside every rebel foolish enough to follow you." Relief washed over Valen, though he kept his expression neutral. Eric, however, showed no gratitude. He simply nodded, his jaw tight as the guards led him away. Though spared execution, he knew this reprieve came with strings attached. Still, he couldn't deny the opportunity it presented, a chance to fight for change without resorting to bloodshed. In the days that followed, Eric and Valen found themselves working together under tense circumstances. They traveled to villages ravaged by poverty, listening to the cries of the oppressed and promising reforms that neither man was certain the king would honor. Along the way, they clashed constantly, Eric's fiery passion often colliding with Valen's measured approach. Yet, despite their differences, a fragile respect began to form between them. Valen admired Eric's unwavering commitment to justice, while Eric grudgingly acknowledged Valen's courage in standing against his own kind. As they worked, hope began to spread among the villagers. At first cautious, then emboldened, the people started to believe that real change might be possible. Markets reopened, fields were replanted, and children laughed again in streets once filled with despair. But behind the scenes, danger loomed. Not everyone in the court supported the king's newfound leniency, and whispers of betrayal echoed through the halls of power. Both Eric and Valen knew the road ahead would be fraught with peril. Their alliance was fragile, built on shifting sands. But as they stood side by side one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, they shared a quiet understanding. Whatever happened next, they had already changed the course of history. Together, they had planted the seeds of revolution, not with swords, but with trust, sacrifice, and the unyielding belief that even the most broken systems could be rebuilt. The kingdom was changing, though not everyone noticed at first. In the weeks that followed Eric and Valen's efforts to broker peace, small but significant shifts began to take root. The king, pressured by both the growing unrest and Valen's persistent appeals, reluctantly agreed to implement modest reforms. Taxes were reduced for struggling farmers, grain reserves were distributed to famine-stricken villages, and corrupt officials were quietly removed from their posts. While far from perfect, these changes offered a glimmer of hope to those who had long felt abandoned by their rulers. Eric, still under close watch, became an unlikely ambassador between the villagers and the crown. His towering frame and gruff demeanor initially intimidated the courtiers, but his sincerity won them over. He spoke plainly, without flowery language or false promises, and the people trusted him because he shared their struggles. When he stood before a crowd in a village square, explaining the new measures and urging patience, they listened, not out of fear, but out of respect. Eric had gone from being a fugitive to a symbol of resilience, proving that even someone branded as an enemy could rise above hatred to fight for unity. Valen, too, found himself transformed by the experience. Once rigid in his loyalty to the crown, he now questioned everything about the system he served. Though he remained captain of the guard, his methods changed. He trained his men to treat civilians with respect, emphasizing fairness over force. Some soldiers resisted at first, clinging to old habits, but many came to admire Valen's vision of a more just kingdom. "We're here to protect, not oppress," he reminded them often, his words echoing through the barracks. Yet, not all were pleased with the newfound cooperation. Among the nobility, whispers of discontent grew louder. Several high-ranking lords resented the king's concessions, viewing them as weakness rather than wisdom. One evening, during a lavish banquet in the castle, One such lord openly challenged Valen. "You've let a brute dictate terms to the crown," the man sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Is this what passes for leadership now?" Valen met the insult with calm resolve. "If listening to the needs of your people makes me weak, then so be it," he replied evenly. "But if you value power over humanity, perhaps it's time to reconsider where your loyalties lie." Though tension simmered within the court, the bond between Eric and Valen only strengthened. Their partnership, forged in conflict and tempered by mutual respect, proved stronger than either had imagined. They weren't friends, there was still too much history between them for that, but they shared a common goal: to create a world where justice wasn't reserved for the privileged few. One crisp morning, as winter gave way to spring, Eric stood atop a hill overlooking a bustling market. Children chased each other through the stalls, laughing freely, while merchants called out prices for fresh produce. It was a scene he'd never thought possible when he first fled into the forest. Beside him, Valen watched silently, his armor gleaming in the sunlight. "Do you think it'll last?" Eric asked after a long pause. "I don't know," Valen admitted. "Change is fragile. It can break as easily as it begins. But I believe we've planted something worth fighting for." Eric nodded, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Then let's keep fighting." As they turned to leave, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, the wind carried the sound of laughter from below, a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope could bloom. Together, Eric and Valen had proven that enemies could become allies, and that redemption was always within reach for those willing to seek it. The kingdom was far from perfect, but for the first time in years, it felt alive, with possibility, with promise, and with the courage to dream of a better tomorrow.